Welcome to the Office Developer Training Content Module, Microsoft Teams Developer for Authentication. My name is Paul Schaeflein. I'm a Microsoft MVP in Office Development. This module is discussing authentication in Microsoft Teams from the developer perspective. We're going to talk about authentication in bots, and then we're going to talk about authentication in tabs. When we authenticate in a bot, there are two approaches, and the simplest approach is going to be by far using the Azure Bot Service. But we'll talk about how the mechanics of authenticating to Azure Active Directory in a bot works, and then we'll review the Azure Bot Service and the OAuth card, and then a demonstration that reviews the code that we can use to make this happen. No conversation about authentication is complete without the sequence diagram. And as you can see here across the top, we have the user, the Microsoft Teams application, the bot that you're writing, and some type of identity or OAuth 2 provider. Throughout this module, the OAuth 2 provider will be Azure Active Directory. You need some trigger within your bot to require authentication. The user is going to send a message of some type to your bot, and the bot will then determine that we need to sign in. Right? Perhaps the message to the bot is requiring profile information about the user. In order to get that profile information, the bot needs to have a token. So this is where we would say we now need to do some type of authentication. So the bot then creates some kind of state to make sure that the URL, the authentication happens within the same context, and gets a URL for an authentication page, typically a login page. It will then return an OAuth card with the sign-in action, and the sign-in action will have the URL to start with the authentication process. Like any web-based authentication, we need to have some URL that's going to allow the user to click a button to redirect to our OAuth provider. That is what the OAuth card will do with the sign-in action. The user clicks on the sign-in button, and you'll notice now in the middle of the slide there is a gray box that says pop-up window. When the user clicks on the sign-in button within the OAuth card, Microsoft Teams will facilitate opening the pop-up window and navigating that window to the sign-in URL that the bot replied. That URL that you've written should redirect the user to the authorized endpoint for the OAuth 2 provider, and which then the OAuth provider then takes control and navigates back and forth to the user to get them to log in with whatever credentials are required. Using Azure Active Directory, once the authentication happens, the consent, if necessary, will be negotiated. Assuming that the user logs in correctly and grants consent, the OAuth 2 provider will then redirect back to the bot's redirect URL. This is something that's configured with the OAuth 2 provider at the time the application is registered. That redirect URL gets the state that was initially provided by the bot, as well as an authorization code. The bot takes the auth code and redeems that for a token. And then the token is returned back to the bot's auth start page. And that auth page can then call notify success within the Microsoft Teams API, passing the authentication, the access token back. The Microsoft Teams application will then verify that the code is successfully retrieved and call the notify success page, which closes the pop-up, and Microsoft Teams then sends the invoke message back to the bot. The bot can then verify that the state they came back through the verification message is what they expected, and then I have a token that's ready to use, and then can move on with the process as designed. To accomplish this flow with the Azure Bot, accomplishing this process with the Azure Bot Service makes things much simpler. The Azure Bot Service supports the OAuth card, and it lets you use this for many external data providers. There are some restrictions for the OAuth card, however. The card will not work with guest access, meaning the user who is using the OAuth card must be a member of the tenant in which the bot is trying to access this data. It will not work with the free version of Microsoft Teams. It can only be used for bot authentication. It only works for bots that have been registered in the Azure Bot Service. And the Bot Framework SDK for Node does not currently support that. But assuming these restrictions don't apply to you, you get some tremendous benefits for Teams developers by using the Azure Bot Service. You get an out-of-the-box web-based authentication flow. The full sign-in experience happens completely within Microsoft Teams. It includes token management, and that means the Azure Bot Service will store the refresh token and, if necessary, use it to get a new access token. No token storage is required by the developer in this scenario. And there's out-of-the-box support for many OAuth providers. So let's walk through a bot here using the Azure App Service and the Auth2 card. Returning to Microsoft Teams, we are in a channel in a team. In this team, we have loaded the bot that has this authentication capabilities. The bot has been extended with a profile command which returns the name and title of the current logged on user. Here you'll notice I'm logged in as Megan, so Megan will @mention the bot and then issue the profile command. The bot responds with the name and title in a sentence for Megan Bowen. How does this all work? First, we need to review the capabilities that are set up within the Azure Bot Service. Here you'll see the Azure Blade for the Azure Bot Service. In previous modules, we used the dev.botframework.com registration site to register the bot. Microsoft has moved a lot of those capabilities to the Azure Bot Service and providing this additional capability. So with a new bot channel registration, I can then configure a bot. If you look, you'll notice there's a very similar information that's required from the old registration portal with an icon, a name, a handle, description, including our configuration endpoint. In addition, we want to use the OAuth capabilities that comes with Azure Bot Service. If I scroll down to the bottom of the settings blade, you'll notice I have a setting for OAuth connection settings. When creating a connection setting, you can give it a name that you would refer to in code, and then pick a service provider. You'll see a lot of popular service identity providers are already are available for configuration, and I would choose Azure Active Directory. When I do that, you'll see information that is very familiar when I'm trying to have a program call and get a token from Azure AD. I need a client ID and a client secret because this is a web app. With a grant type, which you would typically use authorization code. Then the login URL, which is login.microsoft.com, my tenant ID, and the resource for which I want a token, right, which is typically graph.microsoft.com. Right? So this is very straightforward information. But thinking this through, you'll notice I need an application registered with Azure Active Directory in order for this to work. And so the best practice in my recommendation is not to use the same application that the bot creates, but rather create a new application registration. And so if I go into the application registrations in this tenant, I have a new one that I've created, the talent management, and in this particular one, the settings are what you'd expect to see. We have the reply URLs, and here is this one particular difference, is that I need to register as a reply URL, the token.botframework.com. This is the URL that will handle token management for me. The Azure Bot Service will initiate that token acquisition. It will then cache the refresh token if necessary, and we'll just pass this information back on to my bot. In addition, I need to set the permissions that are required for this particular application. I want to get information. I'm going to use this application later to do other things. So the list, that's why there are 6 delegated permissions selected. But this is your typical capabilities that you would do with registering an application within Azure Active Directory. So with that information configured, I can now go to my bot. What we've done is extended this. It's a similar pattern to what you've seen in other modules where the messages controller is calling the root dialog, and the root dialog is looking for the various commands that have been issued, and based on the command, it's going to call a command handler. In this scenario, it's called handle profile command because we did the profile command. This is a simple dialog. It's going to just say pass the call onto a get token dialog. The get token dialog is provided by the Bot Builder SDK. In the constructor of the get token dialog, I'm going to pass in the connection name, and this is a variable which is reading that connection name from web.config, and then we're going to then pass in some Some string parameters you can see: a sign-in message, the label for a button if necessary, the number of retries, and then some type of a retry message. This is all I need to pass in to the token dialog constructor, and as you notice, I'm passing the context to the get token dialog. When the get token dialog finishes, it will call the list me method. This is a typical pattern that we have in Bot Builder v3 for dialogs. The list me method quite simply takes the response from the dialog and awaits that response to get my token, and it uses that token as a bearer token in an authorization header when I'm making a call to Microsoft Graph. And so this particular code is not very different from what you'd see in many other implementations of Microsoft Graph, and we are just simply taking the display name and the job title of the /me, the current user, and rendering that in a sentence. And thus you can see how it will register or replay Megan's information. Next, we're going to sign out from Megan, and let's sign in as a different user and try this again. And so I'm going to log in as the tenant administrator. Not that administrative utilities are required, but just because it's another account that I have. So I'm going to log in with that account. Now this particular user is not a member of that team, so let's just add this bot to another team. So we're going to go through and manage our team as we would typically do. Just to make sure we have this fresh, we're going to delete any existing ones that might have been there and make sure we upload the correct directory. We'll add this in here as well. And now I'm going to return back to my general conversation and mention the bot, and I'll request our profile. Now you'll notice this is the first time I'm executing this code as the administrator. So the token acquisition failed, or I shouldn't say it failed, but the Azure Bot Service could not successfully require a token on first attempt. So it's now showing our sign-in message and the button. And so I will click, that was an OAuth card rendered for us by the Azure Bot Service, or by the, an OAuth card rendered for us by the Bot Builder SDK. When I click sign in, you'll notice I get my same sign in dialog. I'm currently the administrator. I will do that. Now, if you remember, I had to type in my password in the web browser just a moment ago. So I didn't have to, the cookie authentication for Azure AD is still in effect. I didn't have to type in my password a second time. I just needed to go through that sign in experience. You'll notice here it's showing my name, and for this administrator account, it does not have a title. So even though it looks incorrect, the correct values are shown. One other thing to point out is that when I did this app registration, I'm writing an application for this one organization, and so having the administrator provide consent then reduces that strain on the users to do the administrative consent. However, it is supported with the OAuth 2 card. When you click that sign-in button and you get that pop-up window, if consent is required for the user for whatever permissions the bot is attempting to acquire, the consent dialog will work just as you've seen in other Azure Active Directory scenarios. Let's move on now to doing authentication for a tab. Again, we have a sequence dialog for the authentication flow for tabs, which is very similar, except in this particular scenario, we have a tab in the third column instead of the bot. So on some type of tab, either from our configuration page or our content page, we need to indicate to the user that, or we determine based on the user's information that we need to do some type of authentication. Again, the tab is responsible, which you being the developer have to then set up your authentication state and construct the URL for the authentication page and place that pass that information to the Microsoft Teams.authentication.authenticate method. This is part of the Teams SDK, and it will then handle the authentication dialog. When you call Authenticate, you can pass in the URL that is used to handle the response. You pass in callback methods for success and failure. Microsoft Teams will call the appropriate callback method so that you can proceed accordingly. If you notice that in the middle of the diagram, there's a red box that says pop-up window. Again, calling that Authenticate method, Microsoft Teams creates a new pop-up window and navigates to the authentication, the URL provided to you in that call, by you in that call. That page would typically then redirect to the auth provider at the authorized endpoint. The authentication provider will render its sign-in page and handle sign-in and consent as necessary. And when it's done, it will then redirect back to the redirect URL with the access token. That redirect URL would be a page that you've written. It is then hosted in that pop-up dialog as well, and that data comes back. Your page would then validate that the token is correct or for the correct user and call the notify success method on the Teams.authentication class, which then tells Microsoft Teams to close that pop-up window and then call your success callback. You can pass data into the Notify Success dialog, and that data then will be passed to your callback by Microsoft Teams, and that would be how you'd pass the token back to your code. Then, after the success callback is complete, you're expected to actually display the original page that the user was requesting, whether the configuration or the content page, but now you have the access token and you can get the data as necessary. At the very bottom, you'll notice there is the alternate path, and this is a scenario in which the authentication fails. If the user closes the pop-up dialog without clicking OK, Microsoft Teams will detect that and call the failure callback. In your redirect URL, that page, if you get a token or you don't get a token, or you get an error message from the auth provider, or you get a token that's not valid, you can call notify failure and passing in some type of message, and again, Microsoft Teams will close the window and call your failure callback. There are pages that do this in the earlier modules. This particular module is going to go forward with the single sign-on. If you are going to use regardless of the method you're using, whether the Authenticate page is yourself or using the single sign-on, you still need to understand that the authentication has to happen in an iframe, because that's how Microsoft Teams works. Azure Active Directory will not allow an iframe to handle an authentication page because that is a security risk. And that's where the Microsoft Teams library facilitates that pop-up window and passing the data back and forth. So here you can see the method signature of the Microsoft Teams.authentication.authenticate method. You pass in the URL that should be navigated and the success and failure callback, as well as you can then size the login dialog if you wish. At the very bottom, you'll notice it says tabs can only show pages that are in the valid domains list of the manifest, which means you have to then list all those domains in the valid domains in the manifest. You also have to configure your identity provider as necessary. You should do an application registration, again, separate from the bot registration is recommended. Configure your app permissions and information as necessary, including the redirect URLs. Using silent authentication along with single sign-on is a simplified form of signing on your users. Users won't have to necessarily enter credentials every single time if you're using that. In order to use Microsoft Teams, your users have already logged in, and so that application, the cached token used for that authentication can be reused if all the criteria are met. Basically, meaning if you're trying to call Azure Active Directory in the same tenant as the user has already logged in, the token will be valid, and you can use that to get an access token for whatever resource you require. The steps to do this are listed here. You have to include and configure the ADAL library. ADAL is the Azure Active Directory Authentication Library. It supports the V1 endpoint. Right? You then should get the user context so that you can provide the login hint to say, we know who the current user is, we really just want a token for that user. We make our call to authenticate and we process the return value. So let's see that in action. What you can see here is a code snippet that will set up this information. We create our new authentication context with a configuration object. That configuration object would have the application ID and the other information that is appropriate, such as scopes. We then use that authentication context to call the get cached user, which will return, if someone is logged in, it'll return a user. And you'll see there's a quick check to make sure that the the user's profile OID, which is the object ID from Azure AD, matches who we expect it to be. If the current user is not something that we've cached in memory or we've cached in our database, we don't want to use the token for the wrong user, so we clear the context. Then when there's a call to say get cached token, the get cached token will then look in the token store for the authentication contacts in ADAL and return a token for the current user for the specified client application. If there is no valid token, it will return null. And so you can see there's a test to see if I do have a valid token, I can continue showing information. Otherwise, I need to get a token. And you can see there this string is calling the renew ID token function. That will get the ID token for the user. If what you need is an access token, you would call the _renew token instead. In the sample code we have calls renew token, not ID token. So let's take a look at the demo that shows this in single sign-on. Returning to Microsoft Teams, I'm logged in again as Megan. I'm in a team for business development that needs to hire a new member. So we're going to add a channel here for our new hire. Okay. And so this particular channel, obviously we'll favorite this so we can see this. And what we want to see here when we're doing a new hire is perhaps I want to see information about who is going to be hiring. And we can assume all the members of the team are going to be participating in the hiring process, so I want to see information about that. So just to show the capabilities, we're going to go look into Microsoft Teams, and here's the list of members, the list of members of this team. This is the information we want to gather from a call to Microsoft Graph and show the same information on our new hire tab. So again, we've modified the Teams application to do a slightly different tab than what we saw before. So I'm going to add this tab, and I'm just going to list in here the hiring team. And so this page will then go through and call the team, and it will then show these informations for it, right? So again, this is the similar list, the same list of people that we saw in the members tab. But remember, not every user in my team has permission to go through and add members, right? I can have different permissions. So this will let us go through and say, show me the hiring team. And what we've done is we've listed all the members of the team, including their title. Again, the administrator doesn't have a title specified, so that value, even though it says null, is correct. So you'll notice I'm making a call to Microsoft Graph without having to log in again. This single sign-on has happened for me automatically. Let's look at the code at how that is working. This page is our hiring team. Right? This page is loaded from the manifest, so we'll open the manifest and we'll look in here and we'll see that we have a configurable tab in this scenario. So if we come down to the configurable tab, you'll notice it is the configuration URL is our hiring team config page, and if you remember, that prompted only for the title. And then it will be our hiring team.html. We're going to be calling out to Microsoft as part of that, so the valid domains have to make sure we list the information that we're calling. So we're calling back to our page to do authentication. Right? So let's take a look at the hiring team configuration page. You'll notice there is a link to the Microsoft Teams SDK, and then on load it's going to just ask for the name, and when the name is set, it will then call set settings to set the tab name and set the content URL, which is /tab/hiringteam.html. So let's look at hiringteam.html. Again, we have a link to the Microsoft Teams SDK, and we also have a link here to that ADAL library. As we saw in the slide deck, we want to call ADAL to do this. We need to configure our ADAL object. So you notice here we have a client ID and with our redirect URL. So our redirect URL is set up to be this auth.html page. Right? And there's a little note in the comment that says this should be in our list of redirect URIs. So we make sure that we've already seen that's there. So when ADAL knows that we are using this client ID. Right? Then we have a call here that says get the graph data. What we're doing here is we're checking to see who is our current user, and we can do a login hint if we need to do that. Right? We didn't see this in action because Megan had already logged in. But next you'll see this code that was from the slide where we want to get our context. We check to see if the user matches, if the UPN which we're getting from Microsoft Teams matches, then we can use that, but we want to verify. If not, we want to clear the cache. And then we say get our cache token. If the token exists, we call our get data method. If not, we're going to call our renew token. So you'll notice this is slightly different than what the slide deck. This is getting a new access token instead of a new ID token. The renew token has two parameters. The first one is the resource for which we would like an access token, and the second is the callback when this works, right? And we are going to get a single callback with two parameters. It's either the error or the token, right? If there's an error, that something went wrong, we can simply display that. And what the failure would mean is if the user's token expired, perhaps it has timed out, or perhaps it was revoked for a certificate, or perhaps the user changed their password, or perhaps we really haven't seen them before. Even though the user exists, we haven't seen them before. In which case, rather than show an error, we just can log that to the console and then turn on a login button. Otherwise, we go ahead and get our data. Assuming it all works, the get data function really is just calling here. You can see we're calling out to get the members of our group, and then we're going to make our Microsoft Graph call. This particular sample is using the old XML HTTP request object because we didn't want to complicate matters with various libraries. But you'll see we're simply making a call. We're passing in our bearer token, and then for each item that gets returned, we're going to create another div with that person and append that to a table. If you remember, there was a login button that we would turn on if things failed. So the login button has an on-click event that says it calls the login function. If we look at the login function, what we're doing here is we're making a call to that Microsoft Teams.authentication.authenticate method. What we're passing in is this auth.html page. That will be the page that's rendered when this window is open. When the window is closed, either for success or failure, we have our two callbacks registered. So the first callback is a success. In this particular example, what we're going to do is we're going to then pull the token out of the cache, just like we did previously. And if we have the token, we call get data. If for some reason that didn't work, we would just enable the button again. Of course, as it says here, this really shouldn't happen. Why would we call success, but then something failed? But again, we're being extra cautious. And we have our failure callback, in which again we're just logging to the console, right? And you can see there's some other information about the reason why it was canceled, whether it was blocked or the user failed to open it. Right? And then lastly, you'll notice our document.ready. All this, in order for all this to work, the first thing we have to do is call initialize on the Teams context, and then we're doing the get context to get the user's UPN and the group ID. Because if you remember, we were showing the information for the current group. And then the last line here is showing that when the page loads, we're going to try to get the data. We're going to try first, and we'll only light up the login button if it fails. So what's left to see now is this auth.html page. And this page really has, if you'll notice, the body does not have much in it. In fact, all it has in it is script. That page, there's no content that we need to show in our scenario. We just want to facilitate the login from Azure Active Directory. So we have our Teams library, we have our ADAL library. And when the page loads, we initially run the script. First, we initialize the Microsoft Teams SDK. Then we have our ADAL configuration, which is the same as we saw before with the client ID and the redirect URL. Again, we have the authentication context because that's required for all these things. And then there are some methods here that checks to see what's happening. The first time the page loads, it is not a callback. So the window.location.hash will be null, and so this auth context is callback will result in a false, in which case we then call the login method. By calling the login method on this auth context, the ADAL library will redirect to the appropriate URL. It'll handle sign-in either using single-factor or multi-factor authentication. If consent is required, it'll prompt for consent. The login method handles all that information for us. When the login is done, it will then return to the redirect URL. Well, the redirect URL is the same page that we're currently on. Again, this auth.html page. This time, however, the information about the authentication is in the hash, and this if auth context is callback method will return true. If that returns true, we call into the authentication context and we say, hey, handle that window callback. Take this value in the hash and do what you're supposed to do with it. In effect, what's happening is it's going to update its local cache, which you can see here is local storage, and with the various tokens, the ID token, any access code, and refresh token that are necessary. And so we're then going to go on and say, okay, double check and see. We have a quick check in here to say if window opener. If you remember, when we first loaded our hiring team page, we made a call to login, passing in the auth.html as our redirect. So it's possible that the Azure Active Directory is redirecting to this page within the hiring team page, not within the pop-up. So if I'm not in the pop-up, that means that this is the initial load. I don't need to do anything here. So all I really need to do is tell Microsoft Teams, if the window opener is false, which it would be on our first load, it just skips over this because the auth context puts the token in its local storage. And if you remember in our hiring team page, we are actually pulling that data out by saying, give me the cached token for the user. So I don't need to have Microsoft Teams get involved in that scenario. If, however, the user had to click the button to log in, this window.opener would be true. If that is true, I need to tell Microsoft Teams that there was a success, right? And or a failure, depending on what happened here. And this is how I tell Microsoft Teams to close that pop-up window. So this combination of pages handles the scenario that lets me then just navigate to a page in Microsoft Teams, and when it's loaded, it silently go through, pull the token out of token cache, and log in the information and get a token and use that token to call, thus making things much simpler for your users. They don't have to remember passwords over and over. So to conclude and summarize our application, we talked about Azure Active Directory based bot authentication. The recommended approach is to use the Azure Bot Service and the OAuth card provided by the SDK to facilitate a login for the users without much work on the hand of the developers. We talked about Azure Active Directory tab-based authentication and the recommendation there to use silent authentication and SSO built upon the ADAL library. Thank you.